My name is Annie. I'm 30 years old, and 2 years ago, I gave birth to my daughter while completely alone. At 8 months pregnant, my husband walked out on me for another woman. I thought that was the end of our story, but I learned otherwise. He only came back after my aunt passed away and left me 7 million. He didn't return with flowers or an apology. He showed up with a smile that looked rehearsed and a sudden interest in seeing our child. Something about his timing felt off. Something was wrong. To understand why, I need to start at the day he left. But first, let me tell you what I wish I'd known then. Quick favor before we move on. Only 98% of you subscribe after watching. If you enjoy our stories, please hit like and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to us. Already subscribed? Thank you so much. Now, back to the story. 8 months pregnant, standing in my kitchen at 6 a.m. He walked in with a duffel bag and said 5 words. I can't do this anymore. That's when time stopped. No fight, no explanation. Just a man who'd already made his choice. 4 years of marriage, and he was walking away from me and our unborn child like we were strangers. The signs had been there for months. Late nights at work, phone calls he'd taken another room, receipts for dinners I never attended. His exact words as he headed for the door: I need to find my happiness. Everything practical hit at once. Rent due in 14 days. Car payment overdue. I couldn't lift a laundry basket without back pain. And suddenly, I had to figure out how to get to the hospital when labor started. I searched his face for any hesitation, any sign he might change his mind. Nothing. 2 years of complete silence followed. No calls during my pregnancy. No text asking if his daughter was born alive. No support payments. No visits. Radio silence while I assembled a crib alone and attended every doctor's appointment with an empty chair beside me. Labor came on a Tuesday night in February. The nurse asked if anyone was coming to be with me. I shook my head and delivered our daughter entirely alone. She was born at 3:47 a.m., weighing 6 pounds, 4 ounces, perfect and healthy. Her father never knew, never asked, never cared. That absence taught me something crucial about who he really was. While I was learning to survive on 3 hours of sleep and food stamps, he was building a new life with another woman. But abandonment has consequences that stretch further than either of us understood then. 2 years later, those consequences would come knocking. He left, the baby came, survival got loud. Those first months, piano lessons for $20 an hour, selling my engagement ring for $300, stretching soup for 3 days, my daughter sleeping in donated clothes while I clipped coupons, until 2 a.m. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night, 48 hours without sleep, my daughter screaming, my body shaking from exhaustion. I set her in her crib and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, hollow-eyed, bone-thin, barely recognizable. Here's the part nobody saw coming. For 30 seconds, I wondered if I could actually do this. Then she cried louder, and I picked her up again. That moment taught me something crucial. Even when you think you're breaking, your body keeps moving, your heart keeps beating, you keep showing up. Small mercies appeared. A neighbor leaving food by my door, a parent support group that became my lifeline, initially for the free snacks, eventually for the reminder that I wasn't the only one barely holding on. But here's what I learned about rock bottom. It has a sound. It sounds like choosing between diapers and dinner. It sounds like your phone getting disconnected because the bill can wait, but the baby can't. It sounds like every door closing, except the ones you push open yourself. 24 months of that. 24 months of proving I could survive anything. I thought that was my story. Single mom beats the odds, builds something from nothing, finds peace in small victories. But just when I thought I'd finally made it, loss rang again, this time with a lawyer on the line. My Aunt Margaret was the kind of woman who always seemed untouchable. She never married, never had children, and built a life entirely on her own terms. She owned her home, ran a successful business, and traveled the world as if she had nothing to fear. When I was young, I remember her arriving at family holidays in tailored coats, carrying gifts that felt almost too elegant to open. She wasn't soft or overly affectionate, but she was steady. As I got older, our contact grew less frequent. She lived in another state, and most of our connection came through quick birthday cards or the occasional phone call. Even so, she made a point of asking about my ambitions and, later, about my baby. It always surprised me how intentional she was in those brief conversations, since she kept her distance from much of the family. I never once imagined her life and mine would overlap in a way that could define my future. That perception changed the morning I answered a call from her attorney. Margaret had passed away quietly after an illness she never shared. I sat at my kitchen table, phone pressed to my ear, while my daughter scribbled with crayons at my side. Grief settled over me suddenly, sharper for being so unexpected. We were not a family that gathered often, and now she was gone with no warning, no chance for goodbyes. But this call held a twist. When I was invited to the reading of her will, I debated not going. Gas money for the trip would cut into what I had set aside for the week's groceries, and I worried about arranging childcare. Part of me assumed that whatever she owned would be divided among cousins or donated to causes she believed in. I sat stiffly in a quiet office, clutching my bag, expecting to hear her wishes spoken aloud and then be dismissed. Instead, the lawyer unfolded a thick file and read words that seemed impossible. My aunt had left her entire estate to me, $7 million in cash and investments, her home, full ownership of her business. I sat frozen, the numbers repeating in my mind as if they belonged to someone else. For years, I had calculated groceries down to the last coupon, and suddenly, there was enough to change everything. My first reaction was disbelief. Grief was still heavy in my chest, but another feeling began pressing against it: relief. The constant terror of not being able to provide evaporated in a moment, replaced by something new: responsibility. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had to make choices about how to live, and those choices had long-reaching consequences for my daughter's future. Sitting in that office, signing the first papers, I realized my life had shifted completely while I was still mourning her absence. The changes took hold quickly. I left the cramped apartment behind and bought a modest house with a small yard where my daughter could finally have space to play. I opened a secure account in her name that couldn't be touched until she was older. Grocery shopping became less of a battlefield. I could pick items without silently calculating each coin in my hand. For the first time since she was born, I lived without a constant tide of panic carrying every decision. But even in that relief, I noticed something unsettling. Wealth has a way of shifting the air around you. Relatives who hadn't called in years suddenly wanted to know how I was coping. Old acquaintances reached out with practiced warmth that felt just a little too curious. Even the few friends who had stuck through the lean years started to ask different questions about what I was spending money on, where I was living now, how much had changed. No one was cruel or obvious, but behind the words was an edge I recognized. People saw me differently. It unsettled me, and for the first time, I wondered how long it would be before someone tried to step further into my life than I wanted them to protect what had been left behind. I returned to my aunt's attorney for guidance and sought legal counsel of my own. We made sure the money was secure, managed properly, and shielded from anyone who might try to claim it. I didn't want to think of it as mine alone. It was my child's safety net, my way of shielding her from the constant fear I had once lived with. Every decision I made about the inheritance began with that in mind. It didn't erase the past or heal every wound. Losing her hurt and sudden wealth didn't make me whole again, but it gave me space to breathe. It gave me the chance to imagine a future for my daughter where stability wasn't just a dream. I thought maybe peace was finally possible, even if it came with complicated feelings. I was wrong to believe that nothing else would disturb that peace. If you're still with me, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Peace has a sound, so does its ending. It was a Thursday afternoon, quiet except for the sound of my daughter pushing a toy truck across the floor. Then came a knock at the door. When I opened it, I froze. Standing there was the man I once called my husband. The same man who had walked away 2 years earlier while I was 8 months pregnant. His hair was neatly trimmed, his shirt pressed. He carried no luggage, no flowers, no explanation, just a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. What unsettled me most was the timing. Just days earlier, my aunt's will had been read, and somehow, almost immediately, here he stood. I had shared the inheritance with very few people, yet his sudden reappearance felt too sharp, too precise to be chance. My throat went dry as he spoke his first words. I've missed my family. I want to meet my daughter. The lines came out polished, as though he had repeated them in his head until they sounded natural. But to me, that smoothness was its own warning. It wasn't until later that I discovered how he had found out. His buddy's girlfriend worked at a branch of my bank, and she had mentioned a large wire into a guardianship trust account. The information had somehow made its way back to him. Then he slipped. Big. The slip came during one of his early visits, when he asked casually, how much cleared from that wire? Wow, 7 figures. The question hit me like ice water. He shouldn't have known about any wire transfer, let alone the amount. That's when I realized his return wasn't driven by paternal longing. It was calculated. Every instinct told me to close the door, and yet I couldn't ignore the fact that this was my daughter's father. While I hesitated, he filled the silence, his voice dipping into rehearsed remorse. I was broken when I left, he said. I've thought of you both every day. I just want to make things right. He spoke of his loneliness, his regret, but what he never mentioned was my loneliness, or the delivery room he had left me to face alone. Then he crouched low, bringing himself eye level with the child he had never met. My daughter paused, staring with open curiosity, and then came the word, simple, instinctive, devastating. Dad. No one had taught her to say it, yet the sound of it filled the room like a blow. My chest ached with the weight of it. She didn't know abandonment or betrayal. All she saw was a man that biology told her belonged. My husband's eyes softened at the word, but whether it was paternal emotion or calculated triumph, I couldn't be sure. After that, he began finding ways to linger. He spoke about how children thrived with both parents, about how sharing responsibility could lift the weight off my shoulders. His tone was always gentle, persuasive, designed to make his presence sound not just welcome, but necessary. He avoided hard answers, never saying where he had been these 2 years, never explaining why he returned now, as if skipping details kept the story believable. On the surface, he seemed changed. He washed dishes, offered to fix a dripping faucet, praised the way I had managed on my own. These gestures looked like care, but felt rehearsed, as though each one was part of a performance. The repetition of his apologies made them hollow. One evening, when I finally pressed him, he answered softly, I just don't want to miss any more of her life. It sounded sincere, but inside, that gnawing suspicion kept growing. I set boundaries quickly. I allowed supervised visits, never leaving them alone for long. Outwardly, I nodded, smiled faintly, let him play blocks on the floor. Inwardly, I wrote down every interaction, making sure I had a record. And to anyone listening now, let me share this as simple advice. If someone reappears right after your life takes a sharp turn, trust your instincts and keep documentation. Over time, I watched how his curiosity always circled back to the same subtle subjects. How I was managing, what plans I had for our new home, whether I had protections in place for the future. Money hung between us in silence, never named, but never absent. His return was too neat, too aligned with the shift in my circumstances to be believed. As I watched him kneel on the rug beside my daughter, stacking colorful blocks into wobbly towers, the weight of the question pressed harder each day. Was he here because he truly wanted to be a father, or because he wanted access to what now surrounded us? That gnawing uncertainty grew louder with time until the small tells of his behavior began to answer it for me. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. He showed up in the evenings, knelt beside our daughter to play with toy cars, and asked harmless questions about bedtime routines and favorite meals. For a moment, it looked like he was trying to step into the role he had abandoned. But as time passed, his focus began to shift. His questions weren't about the child he had missed. They were about me, and more pointedly, about what I now owned. One night, while we cleared dinner plates, he casually asked how I had managed to afford our new house. Another time, he brought up the business my aunt left me, wondering aloud if I planned to manage it or sell it. His tone was smooth, phrased as curiosity, but I could hear the angle underneath. The most unsettling moment came when he slipped a question into conversation, asking if I had a will in place and who would handle things if something happened to me. On the surface, it sounded like concern. Beneath it, I caught the same practiced calculation I had heard in his apologies. It became clearer when I saw how he reacted to anything tied to money. One afternoon, he spotted a bank statement on the counter and picked it up without asking, scanning it with sharp eyes before I snatched it away. A few days later, over coffee, he floated the idea of us looking for a bigger house, one closer to his office. He wove his way from small talk to shared expenses with unnerving ease. These weren't the words of a father seeking closeness. They were the moves of someone circling an opportunity. So I tried something. I told him I had already set up a trust fund for our daughter, one no one could access until her 18th birthday. His face froze for a fraction of a second before he asked, too quickly, why I hadn't mentioned it before. Then he pressed further. Wouldn't it be safer if he had some say in case something happened to me? The calmness of his voice felt thin, like it was stretched over something more urgent. That was when I stopped questioning my instincts. His pattern repeated: emotional appeal first, financial suggestions second. He talked about making up for lost time and then slid into planning a future together. When I refused to engage, his tone hardened. He hinted that by leaving him out of financial decisions, I was leaving him out as a father. Soon, he shifted to veiled demands. Words like formal parenting rights and custody entered the conversation, and with them came the claim that, as our daughter's father, he had a legal right to weigh in on her future and her money. The mask he had been holding onto began to crack. The day he finally raised his voice, the act collapsed completely. He called me selfish, accused me of using our daughter against him, and announced that a court would side with him. I remember standing across the room, my daughter watching from the floor and feeling the memories flood back. The unanswered calls when I went into labor, the funeral flowers I never received when I buried my aunt, all the nights of silence when he was nowhere to be found. Now, suddenly, he wanted to claim authority in the place he had abandoned. His reasoning had nothing to do with love. It was tethered to the inheritance, plain and simple. Even then, conflict rose in me. I wanted my child to know her father, but not like this, not twisted into a bargaining chip, not turned into an excuse for access to bank accounts. What he presented wasn't fatherhood. It was possession disguised as care. I couldn't allow my daughter's future to be tied to a man who had already shown where his priorities lay. Quick pause. If this is hitting, share this with one friend who needs the warning. Out of urgency, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I sat across from her in a narrow office, outlined the timeline of his reappearance, recited the unnerving questions about wills and money, and admitted my growing fear. She listened carefully, then explained something I hadn't fully grasped. Lawyer: "You're not paranoid, Annie. You're early. Custody or official parental involvement could grant him influence over financial arrangements." From her perspective, his interest in the inheritance was obvious. She urged me to secure protections, place the funds in a trust that allowed no outside access, and document every interaction in case he turned to the courts. Hearing it confirmed by someone whose job was to recognize these patterns was both infuriating and strangely validating. My suspicions weren't wild, they were justified. He wasn't simply a flawed man hoping for redemption. He was an opportunist, placing his bets on my daughter's future as if it were up for negotiation. Walking out of that office, something shifted in me. I stopped waiting for his behavior to prove itself, stopped hoping there might be buried sincerity under the layers of performance. I accepted who he was and what he wanted. And that acceptance, as painful as it felt, gave me back my footing. So I did what felt impossible. I started building a legal wall. It wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about drawing a line that could not be crossed, about protecting both my daughter and what had been entrusted to us. That moment marked the end of hesitation. From then on, every move would be strategic. Suspicions became paperwork. Paperwork became protection. The moment I sat across from my attorney again, the focus shifted from suspicion to action. Justice, boundaries, and moving forward became my priorities. There was no room left for hesitation or hoping he might change. My lawyer laid out the steps in plain language: protect the inheritance, document his behavior, and establish firm boundaries backed by the court. We set up a trust in my daughter's name so the inheritance was locked away for her future, untouchable by outsiders. I kept a written record of every visit, every strange question, every time he hinted at control over money or decisions. My lawyer prepared filings that limited his access, supervised visitation until consistency could be proven, and restrictions on decision-making tied to finances. None of this was framed as punishment. It was protection, built brick by brick, so my daughter's stability couldn't be shaken by manipulation. When hearings came, I simplified my words to what mattered most. He abandoned us when I was 8 months pregnant. He never returned until the inheritance appeared. His questions moved from parenting to finances within weeks. I didn't need to dramatize or explain more than that. The facts themselves revealed his pattern: absence when there was nothing to gain, sudden presence once wealth surrounded me. His polished suit and regretful smile couldn't cover that truth. Courtrooms were exhausting, but each hearing clarified the difference between vengeance and responsibility. I wasn't fighting to punish a man who had hurt me. I was fighting to make sure my child could never be used as someone's shortcut to wealth. That purpose kept me steady when my voice wanted to falter. It wasn't about the heartbreak. By then, heartbreak was no longer the defining wound. It was about protecting what my aunt had entrusted to us and ensuring my daughter's life was guided by love, not opportunism. The longer the legal fight dragged on, the clearer the boundaries became in practice. He could see his child, but only in a setting where safety and consistency came first. He could claim regret, but regret alone wasn't enough to earn trust. Documentation, restrictions, and court orders reminded both of us that fatherhood wasn't a title to be picked up when convenient. It required proof, commitment, presence. Without those, the door stayed shut. During this time, my view of the inheritance shifted too. At first, the number had loomed over me as a dizzying promise, almost tempting me to see it as mine. But in the battles that followed, I stopped seeing it as personal gain. It became my daughter's shield, the fund that would ensure her education, give her choices I never had, and protect her from instability. My role wasn't to spend this newfound wealth, it was to guard it. That responsibility felt heavier than luxury ever could, but it grounded me in a way nothing else had. At night, I sometimes reflected on the idea of closure. For a long time, I thought I needed to make peace with him to heal. That the only way past betrayal was in reconciliation. But as the months wore on, I learned healing was already happening. It was in every bedtime story I read when exhaustion weighed me down. It was in every bill I paid on time, every layer of protection I built for my daughter. He didn't define my worth. My actions did. That understanding was its own form of justice. Outside of the legal work, I began rebuilding a life that felt like my own. Therapy helped me peel back years of survival mode and rediscover myself. A support group introduced me to other single parents who knew what resilience looked like firsthand. Slowly, I picked up the threads I feared I had lost: the music lessons, the small hobbies, the community ties. I was no longer just surviving betrayal, I was creating a future without it. Meanwhile, his involvement faded. The stricter the protections, the less interest he showed. His visits became inconsistent, his lawyer's arguments less aggressive. Without financial gain in reach, the image he had tried to project of a father longing for redemption unraveled. Watching him retreat didn't hurt. It confirmed what I had known deep down. His return had never been about love. It had always been about advantage. By then, I understood something deeper than court victories or financial security. Wealth wasn't the true safety net. Resilience was. Before the inheritance, I had already carried my daughter and myself through fear, hunger, and silence. That strength mattered more than the money because it ensured I would never collapse in the face of someone else's ambition again. If you ever find yourself suddenly inheriting or facing people who reappear when fortune changes, take this as advice. Consult a lawyer early and document everything. Those steps can protect not only your finances, but also your peace of mind. And as I look toward the future, I realize the real questions are no longer about wealth or betrayal. They are about family, love, and presence in the hardest moments. Because those are what define us far more than the dollar signs ever could. In the end, what defined my journey wasn't money or loss. It was learning that presence and consistent care are what truly create family. Resilience carried me forward more than wealth ever could, and integrity became the promise I wanted to keep for my daughter. Do people who abandon families deserve a second chance? Why or why not? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you're in a situation like mine, consider reaching out for support, whether it's legal counsel, local groups, or trusted friends. If this hit home, tap like, share with one friend, and subscribe.